As for this evening, we've been talking about the great stages or the great aspects of the spiritual path, the spiritual life, and we've been talking recently particularly about spiritual death and rebirth. What we're going to do tonight is have three short talks from three different people on, as it were, personal experiences of spiritual death and spiritual rebirth. So I'm going to kick off, and then Suryamati is going to speak, and then Upeksharaja is going to speak. So we'll speak for about 15 minutes each, describing some sort of personal experience of spiritual death and rebirth. So I'm going to kick off, and I'm not going to talk about some sort of mega insight experience when I got enlightened and ceased to exist as an autonomous, separate being. I'm just going to talk about some big changes that happened to me when I was in my early 30s. I'm sort of going to talk about the death of me as I was in my early 30s. So at that time, I was really rather successful in career terms. I was well paid, I got an interesting job, about 15 people working for me, which was pretty good at about 32. I think it's fair to say I was a bit of a blue-eyed boy with the senior management in where I was working. I was married, I had a nice house with a third of an acre of garden in a really nice village. I think you could have put me in a colour supplement. You could have made a colour supplement article about me. But there was definitely something missing. As I described it later, it felt like I was living somebody else's life. As a child and a teenager, I'd felt really quite a strong urge to have a serious spiritual dimension in my life, but I seem to have lost sight of that somehow. I seem to have lost sight of it and just gone for the nose bag. I've got a lot of the things that are supposed to make us happy, but at some level, not much. It didn't mean much to me, to be honest. I have to say, I was pretty addicted to the lifestyle. If you suggested I simplify my life, I probably would have thought, well, impossible. That wouldn't be simplification, that would be squalor. I was pretty addicted to the lifestyle, but at the same time I was unfulfilled and rather empty. And too busy to really take note, too busy to sit down and look at it. And the death of that version of me happened at least in a couple of stages. In the first stage, I got ill. First of all, I got ill. I got genuinely physically ill, so that I'd actually needed an operation, quite a serious operation. As a result of the worry about my health, I got depressed. And as a result of that, my marriage split up. My wife at the time signed up for a strong, successful husband. Not the one she seemed to have at that particular time. And of course, at the time, all of this seemed like a total disaster. My world had fallen apart. But just a little while later, I looked back and saw what happened as something that needed to happen. Something that really needed to happen. Something that liberated me from a prison I'd created for myself. There was absolutely no way in hell that I could have let go of that lifestyle of my own accord. My conscious mind, I was not going to do it. I was imprisoned in the life I had created for myself and in my self-image that I'd created, because I couldn't conceive of doing without it. But it's as though, I, as my conscious self, couldn't do anything about it, but it's as though something deeper, from deeper levels of me, just reared up. And said, well, I'm not having any of this. This is no way to live. Let's bring it all crashing down. And that's what happened. So there's a Buddhist author called Reginald Ray, and in a really poorly titled book called Secrets of the Vajra World, which sounds amazing, doesn't it? In Secrets of the Vajra World, he says, Western Buddhists often think about this idea of Buddha nature, and they think about Buddha nature as being this sort of part of ourselves that's lovely and expansive and safe, that we can perhaps touch in meditation. But he says that the way our potential for spiritual growth actually manifests very often is as something that prods us and pokes us and makes us anxious and dissatisfied as long as we are not living a meaningful life. As long as we're not living the life we should be doing, it's going to have a go. It's not going to be satisfied. It's not going to let us settle down. So it comes out as all these things which we sometimes regard as very negative. It's something uncomfortable and dangerous that can make us anxious and depressed, even ill, unless we actually live a meaningful life. And I think that's what was going on with me. Looking back at me, it was obvious that that was why I was suffering from depression. It was so something in me was saying, this is no way for you to live your life. I'm not having it. I'm not having it. Change or I'll make you very, very unhappy, even ill. And I'm really glad that I didn't try to pacify that with chemicals, actually. I took, doctor prescribed me antidepressants, I took one and threw them away. And I just decided to make a lot of changes in my life. Now, I mean, this is dangerous territory because I am absolutely not making any general statements about depression here. I absolutely understand that some people have got depression which has got a chemical basis, and it would be totally irresponsible to suggest that, you know, not taking the chemical solution would be anything other than a thoroughly bad idea. But I am suggesting that we can get plunged into depression and anxiety that hasn't got a long history. Because we're not living the right sort of life, and that the change, because something inside us won't let us be, and that the change, it might be much more creative in some cases to make changes than to try to dull it down. And I think that's true for a lot of unhappy states, when we feel bored and listless or anxious or unhappy about ourselves, or when our life is flat and lacks colour. That can be a sign that a spiritual death and a spiritual rebirth is long overdue. So that would be I've got 5 conclusions here, which I'm going to have to get in very quickly. And my first conclusion is that depression, anxiety, flatness and lack of colour can be a sign that spiritual death is overdue. So I made a lot of changes to my life, one of which was that I started practicing Buddhism. And part of me wanted to really throw myself into the Dharma, and part of me really didn't want to let go of the money and the security and the status that I got from my job. Frankly, I was scared and I couldn't really imagine living on less money than I'd got used to. So although I felt called to make some really radical changes, to be honest, I didn't have the courage to leave my job, even though at that time it had come to seem completely meaningless to me. So I used to talk about how I was going to go, how I was going to leave. And there was a colleague of mine, one birthday, gave me a copy of Waiting for Godot. And I said, well, why did you give me a copy of Waiting for Godot? And he said, because waiting for you to leave is like waiting for Godot. And I am reminded when I think of that of a picture of the Annunciation. There's lots of pictures of the Annunciation where an angel appears to Mary. And there's one particular one that really impressed me, and I can't remember who it's by now, but there's this angel appearing to Mary, offering this incredible new life in the form of these flowers, and she's going, who's it by? Somebody must know. It's a really famous one. You know, often she's going, take me, but in this one she's going, no, I don't want to know. I don't want to know. And I think that's my second thing about spiritual death. We often resist it out of fear. It might be offering us an amazing new life, but part of us won't want it, and we might resist it out of fear. Eventually, though, I reached the point where something attractive enough was offered to me to overcome my lack of courage. I was offered the opportunity to go and help build a retreat centre in Spain. And I speak Spanish, and I love Hispanic culture, and I like the climate, and I like the country, and I like the landscape, and it sounded like a really romantic thing to do. So, whoosh, sold my house, and off I went. Sold my house, gave up my possessions, and then felt really insecure. really insecure. And then there was the reality of what I was doing. It sounded like a nice romantic idea to go and live in the mountains of Spain and do a lot of meditating, but it really wasn't that comfortable at all. Conditions were very difficult, very primitive and very uncomfortable. It was like camping without a tent in the mountains. It was really hard. We spent a lot of time doing hard physical work that I wasn't used to. There was absolutely no entertainment or distraction. There was no opportunities for any of the things I connected with having a good time. And there were no women. And really my only experience of closeness and intimacy had been with women, so a world without women seemed very bleak, actually, and cold. So in the early days I often thought about leaving. I used to comfort myself with at least I can leave any time I like. I'll give it a few more days. So that's my third thing about situations that can lead to spiritual death. Is they're probably really uncomfortable and we won't want them. But if we're unlucky enough to get the situations we want that line up with our likes and dislikes, we're quite unlikely to change, actually. It's likely to be the things we really don't want, that we really won't bail out of, that are transformative. So I often thought about leaving, but then something started to change. The hard physical work, the healthy life, the closeness to nature in a very beautiful environment, lots and lots of meditation, lots of puja, started to have an effect. And I started to experience quite different mental states. But there's a few things I'd really like to pick up on. One was living in a tight-knit community, where the barriers of separation and privacy that usually sort of keep us separate had gone, basically. So that we had to open up to each other and stop putting up any sort of a front. And for me, who at that time was used to putting up a pretty good front, this was totally transformative, probably more transformative than meditation, actually. Just that sort of needing to open up to others, be transparent to others. Drop my defences and my masks. So that would be my third point, genuine community in which we're really forced into close proximity to others is transformative. A few other things contributed. I was exposed to some really scary people like I had never met before. I think particularly of Sangha and Subhuti, who in some ways to me seemed like creatures from another planet that I wanted nothing to do with, who had a level of commitment to something beyond themselves and a willingness to put their own small personal concerns aside to do something bigger than themselves that I found distinctly threatening, actually. Especially as it made my small concern for my own small self stand out really big and put me to shame and challenged me to rise above it, which I found very uncomfortable. And my response to that discomfort was actually often to resent them. So I think our relationships with people who are bigger than ourselves can often be like that, actually. So another general point I'd like to make is that opening up to the influence of very strong people who are bigger than we are can transform us, push us out of our limited views. We can learn a lot by accepting that other people are bigger than us. But we probably won't like it. We might actually feel resentful and blame them for the discomfort that we feel. I was also pushed into doing quite a few things that I didn't think I could do, which pushed me out of my comfort zones very seriously. The one that really springs to mind is having to translate for Sangha from English to Spanish. My Spanish was very rusty, and I remember particularly the philosophy faculty of Valencia University and me sort of trying to use a combination of pidgin Spanish and sign language. And one of the things that really got me was I realised beforehand I was terrified because my whole approach to appearing in public was to not make a fool of myself. And this thought came up, it doesn't matter if you make a fool of yourself, get the Dharma across. And so that's what I did, and it actually worked. So there was something about being able to it not be about me, but about the Dharma. But it actually worked, and actually I've been making a practice of making a fool of myself ever since. So a number of things. Looking back, unquestionably the best year of my life that I spent at Guhiloka, in which I experienced a lot of bliss, felt some discovered mental states I never knew existed, came back with a new strength, a new sense of meaning in life, much more willing to take risks, etc., etc. Came back a different person, still with loads of work to do, still got loads of work to do. But that spiritual death had rescued me from a different sort of spiritual death, the slow death of the spirit through not having the courage to take risks. So that's my example of spiritual death.
Okay, so my talk is also, to some extent, about a place. It's a place much nearer home. It's a small caravan site in the Yorkshire Dales, in Upper Nidderdale, a place called Lofthouse. And it's also a story about a book and a story about shilly-shallying. So, 2002, just over 10 years ago, I went on a solitary retreat in a caravan on a small site in the Yorkshire Dales. It was spring, the hills were just greening up, there were lambs in the fields, there were primroses, there was a plaintive sound of curlews flying over the moors, plenty of opportunities for long walks, which I enjoyed, and sitting by waterfalls and contemplating a very beautiful view from a churchyard high up on a hill looking down over the dale. So I'd taken with me on this solitary retreat my meditation cushions, my walking boots, some food, a notebook for writing reflections, and a book to read. And it wasn't a Dharma book, actually. It was a time when I wasn't sure that I was a Buddhist. I'd been practicing as a sort of, maybe, a Buddhist for about 10 years. But I wasn't really sure that I was a Buddhist. And sometimes if people asked me, I would say yes, and sometimes I said no. And I suppose I also brought to this particular solitary retreat a sense of, a bit of a sense of urgency, a sense of lack. I'd recently given up one of those very big jobs that had just taken all my time and all my energy, because I felt that it was meaningless to give so much time and so much energy to a job. So I'd made more space, and then I just had this sense of, so what have I made the space for? So it was a bit of a turning point for me. The book I'd taken, I've still got the book. I borrowed it from Vadanya. It's called The Perennial Philosophy, and it's a book that was written in 1947, first published in 1947, and written by Aldous Huxley. And the perennial philosophy of the title refers to the common ground underlying the major world religions, rather than highlighting the very obvious differences between the different major religions of the world. The book is seeking to identify common values and common truths lying at the heart of each religion, the sort of truths that have kind of been rediscovered in different epochs by different spiritual leaders. It talks about sages and saints and mystics and theologians and preachers and prophets and philosophers. A lot of very serious spiritual practitioners from every tradition, every world religion, are quoted in the book. And for that reason, I found it a very inspiring read. There's a lot of very inspiring writing by some of the world's best religious writers in it. So it's a book that's looking for a common doctrine about the purpose of human life. And what it finds is that most religions frame the purpose of life as an experience of finding connection or of finding union with reality. And for most religions, that means a kind of union with God, of finding God in some sense. And of course Buddhism frames that slightly differently because it frames it as a union with or a realization of reality itself. So in a way it was the ideal book for a fence sitter like me, because it appealed to my egalitarian ideals. I thought, well, all religions have got common goals and similar paths, so this will be just the book for me to read on my solitary retreat. But I got more than I bargained for. What is profoundly challenging about the perennial philosophy, or what I found profoundly challenging, was the intensity with which the mystics of different religious traditions described their experience of practice. I couldn't get away from the fact that if I was going to get anywhere at all spiritually, then I was going to have to develop a depth and an intensity to my practice that I'd shied away for 10 years in my involvement in Buddhism. And in fact, the book and the surroundings had a very, very profound effect on me. I started the week as a sceptical fence-sitter, and by the end of it, I had decided both to ask to become a mitra and to ask for ordination. So it was a real turning around. It was a very deeply stirring week. It was a very emotional week. Although I didn't really understand what was going on with me, I did feel as if my being was being radically rearranged. It's almost like I started the week as one person and finished it as somebody else. I felt very different at the end of it. And looking back, it was certainly a spiritual death, and probably one of the strongest, maybe the strongest that I've experienced. And even now, when I kind of look back on it, I'm not sure that I can analyse what died in that spiritual death experience. But anyway, I've got one or two thoughts that I will give you now, and then I'll talk about what I think was reborn. So, what died? 4 things, I think. The first, I think, was that the rationalist and materialist blinkers that I'd been wearing just fell away. They just got destroyed. I was very influenced by the popular thinking of the time, that when I'd been a young adult, really. I inhabited a world that was very rational and very materialistic, and I guess the prevailing philosophy which I picked up was that if you couldn't touch something, if you couldn't measure it, then it was simply foolish to believe in it. I had been brought up as a Catholic, but actually I had, in my late teens, just had to give up my belief in God. I just couldn't sustain it. And then as an atheist, believing in God and believing in anything religious just seemed foolish. It not only seemed foolish, but I took a sociology course when I went into further education, and reading sociology books made me realise that what religions do is they take that basic human need for meaning in life and for having some sort of emotional outlet for that, and they manipulate it into something that will keep the population under control. It was a kind of means of social control. So I felt as if I'd been manipulated, I'd been duped. I felt as if I'd been made a fool of. And well, when I gave up God, I was determined that I wasn't going to be made a fool of again. So I'd lived most of my adult life in my head, really. Reason was all, and emotion was very, very suspect. And since I needed to make sense of life, then the sense that I gave to my life was that it was life was a path of self-development, that you kind of made the best that you could of the self that you'd been born with. So I was willing to develop myself, I was willing to tackle difficulties, I was willing to engage in altruistic activity, but I wasn't having any truck with anything emotional, and I wasn't going to go anywhere near anything that smacked of faith. So what the perennial philosophy did for me was it made the spiritual experience of faith respectable. It kind of validated it. It distinguished it both from reason and from emotion. I suppose that what I realised was, if the world's best thinkers and writers from all religious traditions were clear about this, that there was a spiritual dimension to life, then perhaps it wasn't so foolish to take that impulse in myself seriously, and, well, to have faith. So, first thing that died, my rationalist, materialist self. And then closely related to that, I suppose, was the second thing that died was my distrust of my own emotions. I think because I regarded Buddhism as a self-development tool, I'd picked and chosen the bits of Buddhism that I was prepared to practice and believe in. So meditation was useful. I'd been meditating for over 10 years at that point, and I know that I changed enormously over that time. It really made a big difference to me. And I liked basic practical dharma, the wheel and the gap and that sort of stuff, mindfulness, metta, ethical principles. I could sign up to all of those. But I wasn't having any truck with whole sections of Buddhism and whole sections of Buddhism in the movement that I'd come across, which was the Triratna movement, which was then called the FWBO, the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. And for me, the bits that I wouldn't accept were the bits that challenged me emotionally. So I've been very happy with Buddhism as a philosophy, but not with anything that really engaged the emotions. So I didn't even listen to explanations about Shraddha. I'd done faith in my Catholic childhood, and I wasn't going there again. I dismissed the archetypal figures as alien and bizarre Eastern figures that were completely irrelevant to me, and I refused to even try to see what they were about, what they symbolised. And I decided, after leaving many of them in tears, that I would never attend another puja in my life. Pujas didn't just leave me cold, they left me angry and frustrated and tearful. I could see that the shrine and the words, the chanting, the incense were all beautiful, but I refused to let my emotions be manipulated. I could kind of feel the emotional tug and sense the positivity that was being generated. I could almost feel it in the room, but I resisted it with all my might, and I just wanted things to be rational. So, what the perennial philosophy did was to make a case for engaging the emotions as well as reason. And actually, I realised that what appealed to me most about the book were the quotations, the devotional quotations of some of the mystics of all sorts of different religions. It was the devotional stuff that really appealed to me, that really inspired me. And actually, that was a real turning point for me. There's a sense in which I wasn't going to let my reason die. I was always going to keep that sense of perspective. But I allowed myself to acknowledge that my emotions were important, and that the emotional part of me needed a path as much as the rational part of me did. So I decided that maybe I needed to take a look at some books on Buddhist art, and maybe I would try attending some pujas with a different, more receptive attitude. So, the third thing that died, I think, was shilly-shallying. So for a decade, I'd been sometimes a Buddhist and sometimes not a Buddhist. Sometimes a Buddhist sympathiser, but never a committed Buddhist. So I sat on the fence. And what I realised, having read that book, was that I needed to commit. I needed a spiritual path. Even if the path wasn't perfect, it seemed better to just take a path and pursue it wholeheartedly. And because I realised I wasn't going to get anywhere if I just kept sitting on the fence and picking and choosing. And there was something else that went along with the shilly-shallying that was the fourth thing that died, which I've called, the death of my arrogant individualism, or the I can do it myselfism, that kind of supported my fence sitting. Part of my shilly-shallying was a definite resistance to joining a religious group. I set myself apart. as different and frankly a little bit superior, I hate to admit it, to folk who did. And I supported that sense of superiority by finding fault with the committed Buddhists that I came across. I expect you realise that it's nearly always possible to find fault with someone if you really want to, if you really look for the fault. I tell myself that the Buddhists that I met were less intelligent than me, less positive, less something else, and I would use that as a way to feel separate from them and superior to them. I was really shoring up this separate self that was a bit kind of, just a bit better than the average. And I found fault with the movement itself, with the FWBO. I found lots of faults with it. Just to name two. Well, it didn't really, in those early days, conform to my feminist ideals. In those days, there were far more men order members than women, and it felt like the men were running it. And then a senior order member had said some things that I didn't like about gender conditioning and gender roles. So, yeah, didn't like it for that reason. And I didn't like spiritual hierarchy. I didn't like admitting that there were people further along the path than me, more developed than me. I took great comfort in being able to feel superior to people. So I wasn't really ready to admit that there were people who I should be looking up to. Interesting, actually, that one, isn't it? Because in those days, then in conversation with people, then I would maintain maintain principles of everyone was equal in terms of rights and their entitlement to respect and entitlement to be heard and so on. I had this kind of egalitarian attitude, but internally I maintained a position of no one's really superior to me. Which is, I realise, a samskara that is not uncommon. I realise I'm not the only one. But there you go, it doesn't make it any better, really, does it? So the perennial philosophy made me realise that I needed to tread a spiritual path with other people, that I wasn't going to get very far on my own. And that my arrogance it was just arrogance, actually. It was maintaining a false sense of superiority that was protecting myself. I wasn't up, frankly, to carving out my own spiritual path. And I wasn't up to treading a solitary path. I needed Sangha. So, what was born on that solitary retreat? I think the main thing that was born was a sense of connection. A sense of connection with the world and with other people. You can't read a book like the Perennial Philosophy without realising that all human beings basically want meaning and want happiness in their lives. And the first way that I felt connected was that I just felt very connected through that common purpose that most people have, that common aspiration to happiness. So I felt very connected to other people, and I felt very connected to the spiritual practitioners whose words I was reading in that book, who have worked in pursuit of connection. So I felt connected to Buddha, I felt connected to Christ, I felt connected to Sufis and Christians and Pure Land Buddhists and mystics of every religion, really. And I also began to see that connection was really part of the answer, that all spiritual paths are aiming at connection with something higher, whether that connection was with God, or, as in Buddhism, connection with reality itself, or connection with everything that is. The exponents of most religions, I realised, see selfishness as part of the problem, and connection as part of the path. So holding myself apart, treading my own path, was separating me from the world, and what I needed was to connect with it. And for the first time, I understood what Sangha was about, what people at the Sheffield Buddhist Centre were trying to do. It wasn't about joining a club, which I kind of thought it was. That actually it was about living a life for the attainment of meaning and happiness for myself and for other people. And that was a pretty fundamental realisation. The importance of Sangha has stayed with me since then, really. And actually, in the decades since that solitary retreat, it's only really got stronger. So, solitary retreat was a spiritual death and rebirth. It was a major turning point in my life. Nothing was quite the same again. Although the externals of my life, I suppose, were exactly the same. I came back, I lived in the same place, I had the same friends, I did the same job. But internally, actually, I was completely changed. Internally, my orientation was just completely towards ploughing a spiritual path, really, developing a spiritual path. And that year, I became a mitra, and I asked for ordination. And 4 years later, I was ordained. A year after that, I left my job working for a voluntary organisation and came to work full-time at the Sheffield Buddhist Centre. And the rest of most of you know, since that's the life that I lead now, really. And I was thinking that actually now my life is devoted to a spiritual death and rebirth practice, which is not an esoteric meditation, but actually it's the practice of building Sangha. There is something that is a spiritual death and rebirth about building Sangha, and you might like to think about that later. But I think all of us who contribute to the project of building Sangha here, whether it's through vacuuming, as Tansel was this morning, or doing the books, as Sally was this morning, or helping with a newcomers course, or buying the milk, or doing any of the other things that many of you do around the centre, you're doing something for the sake of other people and for the sake of a higher ideal. And to some extent, that's a spiritual death and rebirth. And it's certainly helping others to move, yourself and others, to move towards that. So that's it, really. It's a more personal and self-revealing story than the several stories I've told at recent Sangha Nights. I thought actually it might be helpful to the folk who don't get on with devotional practice, and to those who sit on the fence, as I did for far too long.
Thank you, Suryamati and Vadanya. Actually, Suryamati and Vadanya, between them, have pretty much covered, in many ways, the sorts of the messages, if you like, that are in my story, which is just as well, because I was just going to tell you about a passage in my life over a period of 10 years, and let you kind of make what you want of it. I thought one of the nice things about myths is that we don't necessarily have to put things in the right order. And when I was thinking about my own experience of spiritual death and rebirth, for me it seemed to happen the other way around, that there was a rebirth of some kind, and that was followed some years later by a death that needed to happen for the rebirth to come to fruition. So the story goes back. It starts in around, my dates are a bit wonky now, it's a long time ago, about 1980. It actually begins, there were two births that happened to me within a very short period of time. The first one was not overtly spiritual, and that was that I discovered that I could make a living working as a photographer. And having trained as a social worker and run away from the idea of spending my life in an office working 9 to 5, the idea of being a freelance photographer, a photojournalist, was really exciting. And to think and discover that I could do that and I could probably make a living from it was fantastic. I can't go into the details of how that happened and why that happened. But nevertheless, for me, it opened up a sort of sense of myself as being creative. It opened up a sense of being free. My time wasn't bounded by the usual kind of workday restrictions. And I was going places, I was meeting people. It was fascinating. I was meeting politicians. I was photographing, this is in 1981. I don't know, some of you might remember the riots that happened in 1981. I was there with my camera being charged by the police, and this was all, to someone in his late 20s, that was all really exciting. The adrenaline was flowing, and I'd get back to the dark room that I shared with a few other people, and we'd just talk for hours about our adventures, avoiding being beaten up and avoiding being arrested, and discussing the people that we met, politicians, people you probably know. I mean, I've photographed a lot of people that have since become very well known. So all that was thrilling, really. But about a year after I started doing this, quite out of the blue, I was recommended to read a book. I was just interested in physics because I'd done physics for A-level, and I was interested in certain things about where physics was in its thinking, about the nature of what is the essence of things, really. It was always something that had fascinated me. What are we made of? What's the kind of base which we're kind of founded on? This friend recommended a book to me called The Tao of Physics, and I read this book. And what the book was doing was describing modern understanding in physics and relating it to Eastern traditions. And the tradition that this particular author particularly highlighted, or at least that's what I picked out of it, was Buddhism. And I read this book, and within the space of 2 weeks, really, I think, from being a materialist, rather like Suryamati was talking about, I'd become a Buddhist. I finished that book and I thought, this Buddhism is the truth. It was a revelation, really, and it completely came out of nowhere. I wasn't expecting it, I wasn't looking for it. And intellectually, it completely turned my view of the world upside down. I think, the best way I can describe it, it was like I'd been living in a house and I didn't realise that there was an outside. And that the book was like the doors opening, or rather, no, it wasn't the doors weren't open, no, they remained shut. But the windows, the curtains were drawn back, and I could see out there was a whole universe, that this house was just simply located in a small part of that. And there was this beautiful landscape outside. And at least on an intellectual level, I started journeying into that external world. So there was this other new being born. There was this sort of nascent Buddhist who was born. But there was this photographer who was also living this exciting life. And unfortunately, from a Buddhist point of view, for me it wasn't a problem. Both things were very exciting and very fascinating. But the older brother, being more active, being more established, dominated, and the younger brother, the Buddhist, sat a bit in the background and decided that he would just sort of try and influence the photographer, and that was the way to do it. That was the way to practice as a Buddhist. There was all sorts of wrong views I had in all of this. There was an element of conceit. I thought I understood Buddhism better than I did. I thought I understood myself better than I did. I think I did a bit like Suryamati. I looked down a little bit on Buddhists. I did actually go to the London Buddhist Centre at this time, twice. And I decided that they were rather complacent. They all looked rather cosy. And I was out there in the big wide world trying to sort everything out. I'd come from a sort of left-wing political perspective, and that was where the action was. This is what needed doing. I think, for me, in a way, the name, I was put off by the name, the FWBO, the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. I thought that was a bit naff, and to me, it spoke of a kind bit of lack of oomph. I think that's the best way I can describe it without being too rude. So for whatever reason, I didn't follow it up. I didn't even start meditating. I thought I understood well enough. I didn't even need to meditate. So that gives you some idea of how conceited I was in all this. But then there was all this excitement going on as well. So of course I was really drawn to that. So things moved on. I did well. I did well as a photographer. I earned enough money, and with a slightly dubious but creative accountant, I managed to arrange to get a mortgage. So I had my own flat with a nice little garden, and I was doing very nicely. I was reading a lot about Buddhism and learning quite a bit. Not much about practice though. It was all kind of theory. But things started to go a bit wrong. The older brother started to get a bit ill. The sort of creative spark that kind of drove me sort of began to fizzle out. I found myself doing the same stuff week in, week out. I was photographing things in the same way, and I couldn't get out of this. And gradually, over a period of 2 or 3 years, it began to deteriorate. So I'd been working by this time for about 9 years. So this now brings us into the late 1980s. And the poor old Buddhist in me had sort of gone to sleep a bit as well. I think it probably didn't help having my own garden. I also indulged in growing my own drugs. To be quite honest, I found that I could grow marijuana. It grew fantastically. It was a beautiful plant, and I became a bit of a head actually. I think, that kind of rather tripped out, spaced out kind of, not really able to sort of really get to grips with things. I was a bit sort of, a bit sleepy, a bit dopey really, which is why it's called dope, and I feel very appropriate. Although I always found that whenever I went out to take photographs, I'd wake up. It was quite interesting that when I was interested, all the kind of heady stuff just sort of fell away, and I quite enjoyed that challenge, Anyway, that's a bit of a diversion. So the creative spark began to go, and it sort of got taken over a bit by gardening. I had a little garden, I just got fascinated in the garden, and again, this is a bit of a diversion, so I won't say much more about it, but it sort of undermined the photographer, really. So the Buddhist had gone to sleep by this time, and the photographer was beginning to surveil. He was getting old, he was running out of steam. And then in about 1990, I sort of woke up to the fact that I was depressed. Things had got to a point where there was a sort of stasis and I was really stuck. I was trying to find a sort of creative spark. I was trying to find new ways of working as a photographer and just sort of getting nowhere. It just felt like I was sort of trying to walk through a kind of swamp, really, with no kind of map. And I couldn't find my way out. Then what started to happen, of course, is I started to stop getting work, and I wasn't really looking for it. And I was getting quite agitated. I'd find myself walking down the street and being quite anxious and irritable. And I had this sort of, I think the strongest experience that really woke me up was kind of realising that this irritability would sort of, I kind of thought, actually, if I got into an argument with someone, I'd get into a fight. There was an anger there somewhere as well. And I thought, I need to do something about this. It just so happened that where my darkroom was, the London Buddhist Centre was around the corner. So I thought, I need to do something to deal with this anxiety. Because of my understanding of Buddhism, I thought probably the best thing would be to meditate. I thought it would be worth giving it a go. So I went to the London Buddhist Centre, and very quickly things started to fall into place. I thought, why hadn't I done this earlier? I really was kicking myself because people were talking about things that I'd been thinking about for years. They were articulating it. I came across Sangha explanation or sort of exposition of the Dharma, and it made so much sense. It was a bit like, oh yeah, of course, yeah, he's putting into words what's been going on for me, sort of in my mind, my conceptual mind, was being sort of mirrored back to me much more clearly than I could do it myself. So I started getting involved, I started going along to meditation. I went to an Introduction to Buddhism course and felt very much at home. So the little brother, the Buddhist brother, was beginning to sort of emerge and get stronger. But the process of... then I kind of hit a kind of brick wall. I was not getting any money, and I had to do something. I was getting scared. It was a bit like I was running along, I don't know, some of these cartoons or some of these films where the earth is falling apart. I felt like I was running along, and behind me there was this kind of crack that was kind of chasing me. I was running away from this crack in the earth that was opening up, and that if I didn't run fast enough, I'd fall into it and just get swallowed up in some kind of dark place. So I was running like mad, and I didn't really know what to do. And then I went on a weekend retreat, and it was a working retreat. It wasn't a particularly intense retreat. When I came back, this is the first retreat I went on, so I'd been going along to the Buddhist Centre for about 3 or 4 months. When I came back, on the Monday morning I woke up, and I just thought, I've got to stop working as a photographer. And it was so clear. It was quite remarkable. I couldn't quite understand. Something sort of just happened in that weekend that kind of opened it up, what was going on. It's a bit like all that kind of anxiety and worry came to a head. And a sense that I've got to let go, I've got to drop. The photographer brother's got to die, basically. It was scary. It was really scary because I didn't know what I would do. But I knew that's what I had to do. And I think I had the foundation of practicing with the London Buddhist Centre and sort of what was happening there, and feeling very plugged into that to kind of give me some kind of strength. So I did eventually stop working as a photographer. It took about 3 or 4 months. I took a job doing care work, which I really didn't want to do. I didn't want to go back to that at all. But I did take that on as a sort of bridge, and then thought, what happens now? So the first death was letting go of the photography, which was really very, very difficult indeed. You know, it had been my life, my identity for 10 years really. All that excitement, all that adrenaline, I just had to let that go. But that wasn't really the end of the story, because I bought this flat, and I was in what's called negative equity, so that the flat was worth more, I was worth less than I owed the mortgage company. So I was stuck with looking after this flat. If I sold it, I would still owe lots of money. So I had to stay trying to sort of earn enough money to pay for it. But the London Buddhist Centre kind of beckoned me, really. There were jobs going in Right Livelihoods, and there were places going in communities. And I really wanted to do that. I'd kind of had some experience of communities in the past, and I had some sense of what it was about and what would benefit me from doing that. And I think when I first came across Buddhism, I had a bit of a sort of a vision of myself as a monk in some kind of way. And I thought, actually, I could do this. This is amazing. I could actually do this. I could sort of become some kind of monk. And I was thinking even then of the possibility of getting ordained. But I was kind of stuck trying to keep this flat going, and doing a job I didn't like. In fact, there were times when I really hated it. And it got to the point, I was really in crisis, and in the end, I found a let-out, which I don't really think, I mean, I'm still not sure about the ethicality of it, but there was an organisation, there was a lot of problems people have with negative equity and owing money, wanting to let go of their flats because they couldn't afford the mortgage, because the mortgage rates are very high, but not being able to sell them because they were still end up owing money. This organisation said, there's a way out. Come to us, pay us £200 and we'll sort it out for you. My dad said, they're a con, but I didn't want to know, actually. So what I did was I took their advice, and it felt to me like I was jumping off a cliff. I think the ground behind me was opening up, and I was going to be swallowed up, and then I was running like mad, and I came to a cliff. And I had to jump off that cliff, and what that cliff meant doing was sending the keys of the flat back to the building society and basically disappearing. And this was the advice I was given to do. I can't go into the details of it, it's too complex. But I was told that I wouldn't be left with a debt. So that's what I did, and I moved to the London Buddhist Centre, which was fantastic. This is what I wanted to do. But I was left with this kind of, this thing hanging over me. As it transpired, the building society found out where I lived, and they sent me a strong letter saying that I owed them £26,000. They'd sold the flat, things had moved on, but I was still left with this debt. And I wrote back to them and said, well, this is what I'm doing. I want to be a Buddhist monk. I'm not going to be earning any money in the rest of my life. What do you want me to do? And they wrote back and said, oh. Well, we'll just see how things go for a year or two, they said. And so for a year or two, things just carried on. But then, I mean, I must have got some credit somewhere in my life, because about 4 years later, when I was coming up for ordination, a lawyer who was involved with the movement I was put in touch with him, and he said, we can sort this out. And to cut a long story short, he did. Basically, he wrote a letter on my behalf. The building society said, well, okay, we'll just put things on hold. And then the lawyer said to me, well, look, if you don't get in touch with them, if they send you letters, don't reply to them, within 6 years, by law, any debt that you owe is discharged. They actually wrote to him and said that they were going to put my file in the basement, which in effect meant that they were going to take no action. So I just took a gamble and thought, okay, well, let's hope that works. And as it happened, it did. 6 years passed, I got ordained in the meantime, and the debt's been discharged now. Then I inherited some money. And now I'm actually I don't have to work to kind of make a living, so I'm doing quite well. So it's been very fortunate, but I think for me the big story was just taking these risks, the jumping off a cliff. You know, I've done it other times in the past, which I can't really tell you about, but there's not time. But both giving up photography and giving up my flat, I had to just shut my eyes and pray, I suppose, except I don't believe in a God and I never have. But in effect, I just had to have some kind of hope that it would work out, and very fortunately it has. I think, and then actually, of course, getting involved with the Buddhist Centre and getting ordained, I went through a lot of the processes that the Vadanya and Suryamati have talked about, a lot of internal changes and coming up against who I was. But I think that what started in 1980, 1981, really only was kind of completed. The birth of Buddhism within me only really came to fruition on my ordination day. And I remember very well the words from a puja that we used a lot based on the Bodhicharyavatara. And in fact, some of those words are used in the Sheffield puja. So I want to just end with those, because it's a bit like, I think this little passage just kind of finishes off and rounds off that part of my life. It also nicely leads on to next week's theme and the ordination of Gemma in a couple of weeks. And this is how I felt after my public ordination. Today my birth is fruitful, my human life is justified. Today I am born into the family of the Buddha. Now I am the Buddha's son.